My name is Emily Adams. I will be your MC and facilitator this GEO session. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you all, and thank you so much for joining us today. We are really excited to bring you this parallel session during the virtual GEO Symposium this year, entitled Taking Action on Gender and Social Inclusion in GEO Initiatives. The purpose of this session really is to bring together some key contributors in the areas of the GEO initiatives that are also tackling gender and social inclusion in some way. So we have some great examples from participants all over the world that are going to give their perspectives on some critical activities and tasks and tools that they have executed that have resulted in additional gender and or social inclusion impact. And hopefully we will inspire you as participants to some key takeaways for being able to take action on some of these issues that can seem very intriguing to work on, but maybe difficult to tap into. So in terms of run of show today, whoops, there we go. These are our speakers. We have Catherine Casey from the Severe support team. She's going to be showcasing the Severe Toolkit for Inclusive Geospatial Services. We also have Phoebe O'Dwyer, who is with the Regional Center for Mapping of Resources for Development in Nairobi, Kenya, and she has been supporting the GEO Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion subgroup, so she'll be giving some GEO context on that. We have Krista Straub, who has been working with GFOI as well as Silva Carbon and some of their gender and social inclusion activities. We have Mary Mitkich, who's from GeoGlam and will be telling us a little bit more about how GeoGlam has been incorporating gender and social inclusion. We have Chinaporan Michaya who's with the Asian Disaster Preparedness Center, also with the Severe Network, and she has been working with GeoGlows, and she's also been working on some water-related work with gender and social inclusion, and she's going to give us some best practices there. And then Thomas Moore, who's with Severe Amazonia, who has been working with indigenous peoples as well in the Amazon region, and how that might connect to the GeoBond initiatives. So each of our speakers will have 5 minutes to describe to us some of their work, and then we hope to have a nice discussion afterwards. So we have about an hour, and we'll be trying to keep very close to time so that we can have a nice discussion session at the end. So with that, Catherine, I will go ahead and let you share your screen for the first presentation. Thank you so much.
I'm Catherine Casey, Knowledge Management Lead with the Severe Support Activity, and I'll be presenting today on GEO in Action, Severe's Toolkit for Inclusive Geospatial Services. So Severe is a joint initiative of USAID and NASA that's set up to help 5 different regions of the world use Earth observation data and satellite imagery to address development challenges in their region. So we're trying to make a development impact on all communities around the world, or in the regions where we're working, and we're doing that through the use of application of satellite data. But in order to design impactful services, we have to have an understanding of the development challenge and the need for that service. To break that down, we really need to know who are the users of the potential service and how they relate. Who are the stakeholders, potential future users of that service, and other related parties. We need a strong design that puts that service's plans into action, and we need goals in order to measure our impact. So what Severe did is we consolidated our approach to these 4 items in the center in the form of the Service Planning Toolkit. Now, our toolkit is a collection of 4 tools that help our hubs, Severe hubs, design geospatial services that are inclusive, that are need-based, and that have a collaborative process that's also iterative in nature. So I'm going to walk through our toolkit and our approach to designing geospatial services that are inclusive, and then tell you about our most recent revision to this approach to be even more inclusive. So our first tool is a consultation and needs assessment tool to identify the development challenge the service will address, as well as the key actors that need to be involved to co-develop the service with us. At this stage, we're asking questions such as who are the key stakeholders and how are they currently making decisions? Where are there gaps in information or capacity? And how can we build on or complement existing activities? So our toolkit includes consultation approaches, workshops, surveys, focus groups, as well as resources for those approaches. How to conduct a consultative workshop, for example, with agendas, group work exercises, and templates for capturing discussions. Once we've understood the need and the actors, we need to use stakeholder mapping to make sense of the complex landscape of stakeholders, how they're working, what their decision-making processes are, and to identify where Servier and the service fits into this process. So our toolkit includes tips for stakeholder mapping in a workshop setting and guidance on visualizing stakeholder roles and responsibilities. So we know our actors, we understand how they work together and how decisions are made. And now we enter into service design. The goal for this phase is to unite our hub teams and users in a collaborative process to outline the service design, development, and implementation. So our toolkit includes a service concept template to articulate the service vision and how it leads to impact, as well as 3 definition documents to specify the technical details related to the service's products, data management, and training or capacity building. In order to understand the impact of the service and learn through our implementation, we have a monitoring, evaluation, and learning tool. This focuses on a theory of change to map out in detail how activities and interventions lead to impact. And so our toolkit includes steps to develop a theory of change templates, and guidance on selecting indicators. Servier has been implementing this service planning approach since 2017. But over time, the network struggled to make the design process more inclusive to women and other communities, and to have a concrete way to make sure that the needs of people differentiated by their gender, age, class, minority status, and so on were benefiting equally. So we spent the pandemic collecting case studies of how we and our partners have achieved inclusive services. And we reviewed our toolkit to see where we could make the guidance more intentionally inclusive by adding approaches, examples, and adjusting language and template prompts. So what did we learn? We learned there's lots of opportunities to engage women as stakeholders and users. We can develop communities of practice to engage technical experts, lead women-only trainings as part of the capacity building initiatives. We can partner with organizations that bring expertise or sex disaggregated data, for example. We can be proactive or even retroactive in including women and other communities during consultations and needs assessments and stakeholder mapping phases of service design. We can also embrace the iterative service planning approach. It's a cyclical nature of service planning that provides reoccurring opportunities to assess the varied impacts of a service that the service has on different communities, and to bring in representation of women into the co-design process or other communities that might have been missed. We also have opportunities to understand the development needs of women during service design. So we can use surveys to assess and understand varied impacts. We can, again, use surveys to understand varied modes of receiving information. Training survey collectors as well can be a useful tool to make sure that we get the results we're looking for. Separate focus groups for men and women using sex disaggregated data, and also considering stakeholder intersectionality are great ways to understand the development needs of women and other communities. Finally, we're going to continue learning through implementation. So the majority of our services address gender during implementation, not during the planning process. So we are seeing that gender analyses of existing services can be a useful tool. We also see that involving gender advisors at all stages in service planning has been an advantage. And then finally, not knowing the answer, but simply starting by asking the question is a great first step. So we're pleased to share with you the results of our work to the GEO community, our updated service planning toolkit that is now more proactively inclusive to involve women and other groups in the service design and implementation process. And then our collection of case studies, which we call Servier Service Planning in Action, case studies from demand-driven geospatial services, which focus initially on including women and marginalized communities in the service planning process, but we hope will grow over time to reflect additional examples of how we've put service planning into action. And with that, I'll leave a few links that I'll pop into the chat, and over to you, Emily.
Thank you so much. That was a fantastic overview of our service planning toolkit. And if you all have any questions, we're going to take questions during the question and answer period at the end, but feel free to pop them in the chat as we go, and I'll collect them and help facilitate the discussion at the end. So our next presenter is Phoebe O'Dwyer with the Regional Center for Mapping of Resources for Development. So go ahead, Phoebe.
Thank you, Emily. All right, so I wear many hats, and today I'll be presenting as a member of the EDI subgroup of GEO, where we've been working towards developing an EDI statement and framework of how we want to move EDI forward for GEO. All right, so the subgroup has 6 main objectives. So part of our objective is to develop strategy and approaches to assess, monitor the diversity of participants in GEO activities, identify and address gaps in data and knowledge, and also identify the barriers and how we can be able to address these particular barriers, barriers to participation. Further, we also have an objective to support the monitoring progress and propose strategies as well as actions, and also raise awareness of diversity, equality, and inclusion goals of GEO. We also have an objective to plan for events and activities that promote and celebrate diversity in GEO. The subgroup is made up of 11 participants. So we have, if you look at the list of participation, there is regional representation from literally every corner. So we have Natalie, who is the subgroup's co-chair, and we also have representation from Africa, from America, as well as Oceania. So how we started to be able to understand the EDI challenges in GEO, we conducted a baseline survey. So through this baseline survey, we're trying to look at gender and geographical representation in the GEO secretariats, in events, in the GEO program board, as well as the composition of the GEO working groups. And just looking at the representation from the program board, you can see there's quite some significant representation geographically. But when you start to dive into EDI issues, then this becomes a totally different case. So ideally, this baseline study was supposed to help us in terms of providing guidance on helping us to develop the GEO EDI statements. So when we looked at the EDI, at the working groups composition, you notice that a lot of the working groups, capacity development, climate disaster risk, as well as data, the majority of the composition mostly are men compared to women. So already this tells us that there is something, there's a flip on one side that we need to really look at. In terms of the current members, primarily we have representation almost in every continent, but when we look at particular events, then the scenario becomes also a little interesting. So looking at the last 2 events for 2019 and 2020, for GEO Plenary Week, we realized that 66% of the speakers were men. And actually, when we look at the industry track itself, 70% of the speakers were also men. Then when we look at GEO Week 2020, then we also have a different situation and consider that this GEO Week 2020 was actually a virtual event. So geographical representation significantly increased compared to what was there in 2019. Another interesting scenario that we came across was that all the co-chairs in GEO since 2016 have been men. So basically what this reveals is we hadn't been paying attention before to the diversity of representation, both in speakers, moderators, and also participation either in physical events or in the working group meetings. So through these findings, we developed a statement that basically speaks to having a diverse, inclusive, and supportive GEO community where everyone has an opportunity to participate and benefit. And how we want to deliver this is through a 5-pillar framework. So look at oversight and accountability, community and leadership, creating a welcoming and supportive environment, outreach and engagement, as well as empowerment through accessibility. So what exactly does this mean when we talk about oversight and accountability? So through this pillar, we are trying to ensure that GEO provides a fair and supportive and encouraging environment which diverse participants can be able to participate. And the role of the subgroup here will be to provide recommendation and do regular audits where this is not being met. Under community leadership and advocacy, we want to increase awareness of Earth observation in all communities, basically. And under the pillar of welcoming and having a supportive environment, you want to make sure that the environment is such that everybody is willing and able to participate. Under the pillar for outreach and engagement, here we want to involve each and every community and ensure that the communities are aware of how they can be able to have their needs addressed either through the GEO work program or the regional GEO, as well as other communication channels that may be appropriate. And through empowerment, through accessibility, we want to make sure that we have a transparent and a standardized accessibility to open Earth observation data. Some of the strategies that we are employing as an EDI, we have been able to develop a toolkit that basically will help us in trying to be accountable as far as EDI is concerned. So the toolkit itself is something that is replicable in different institutions, but also looking at activities around the 5 pillars, we are looking at how we can have a more inclusive representation in the areas that we talked about geographically also and on gender. And also we want to use the EDI to be a place where mentorship can be provided to both people of different levels in their career. We want to influence also the awards, the GEO awards in such a way that inclusion becomes part of what is acknowledged and awarded as an excellent performance. And also we want to see how we can be able to be more inclusive to minority groups, to indigenous groups and such like. And we've also been able to integrate EDI indicators in registration. So if you look at the registration for GEO this year, there were some of those indicators that were striving to ensure that we're able to collect that data. We also take cognizance of the fact that there are also many players who are undertaking EDI activities and we want to benchmark based on them. And we want to be able to continuously monitor the activities and ensure that our actions, we are setting targets that are achievable. So we're also working towards downscaling EDI actions through the regional GEOs, who are actually the people who interact with the countries and the member states. And we are applying this in a top-down approach where we have institutions developing policies and strategies that address EDI, as well as a bottom-up approach where we go to the people to understand the EDI challenges they're facing, either in participation or how we can be able to be more inclusive to them. So lastly, I want to put our welcome message that we are taking in members in the subgroup. So if you feel you want to be able to be part of the subgroup and you want to contribute, feel free to reach out to us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Phoebe. A really great presentation. Again, a quick reminder as we transition that you can put your questions in the chat if you have any for our panelists specifically. So I am going to share my screen next and ask Krista Straub to present. I hope that worked. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Emily.
Okay, so Krista, please go ahead when you're ready.
Okay, sorry about that. A little computer delay here. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the invitation to present today. I'm excited to share a brief introduction into the project that I've been working on, as well as our amazing student contractor, Abby McConnell, who is left in that image there, in collaboration with the Silva Carbon Program and GFOI. That's Sylvia Wilson with the Silva Carbon Program on the right. So we don't have a ton of time, so let's get right into it. I'm a social scientist with USGS, and one of my areas of work is around the uses, users, and value of Earth observations. This project focuses on the users of Earth observation, and more specifically, an observed lack of women as users in the field of forest carbon monitoring. Next slide. Did it switch? Oh yeah, sorry, the second one. I'm just viewing a little bit slowly on my side. So I've worked with Sylvia Wilson in the Silva Carbon Program on Earth observation case studies. This project came about when Sylvia reached out to get a social science approach to better understand this imbalance in the number of women and men, both as participants in Silva Carbon's training programs and also who make up their technical experts. As you can see in the bar chart on the left, men shown in the orange column outnumber women in training hours received. Silva Carbon Program itself is an interagency technical cooperation of the US government, and main objectives are to enhance the capacity of tropical forested countries to measure, monitor, and report on carbon in their forests and other lands. It includes input from the Forest Service, USGS, USAID, and other partners. Some of the main areas of focus are shown at the bottom right of the slide. And then 24 partner countries planned for inclusion in this project are highlighted in orange on that map. So the Silva Carbon Program is committed to taking steps to address this observed gender imbalance. The present work that we're doing is to incorporate the individual country context and the experiences of those working in forest carbon monitoring. And then we want to use this information to have a social science informed gender focused options that can be used to help increase women's participation in forest carbon monitoring. Next slide. So these are kind of the guiding questions that we've been using to help with the project. So again, looking at the influence of women's engagement in forest carbon monitoring, focusing on barriers, also factors that may lead to success. How do women navigate gender barriers in forest carbon monitoring? And what are current and proposed solutions that we are gathering from subject matter experts and country participants? Next slide. So in considering our approach excuse me, to the project, we had several challenges that we needed to keep in mind. We needed a framework and method that would allow us the flexibility to move between the micro level of the individual, the meso level of the country, and the macro level of making comparisons across countries. We also needed to account for differences in experiences across those diverse countries and within individuals in the same country. So a lot of different sort of factors that we needed to take into account. I won't go into the framework or theory today, but just to point out that we were thinking about these things. So to do this, we conducted an initial phase of interviews with individuals identified as subject matter experts with broad knowledge of topics such as gender, history and culture, social norms, and the field of forest carbon monitoring within each country. They may not be experts on all of those things, but we tried to gather this sort of information from these subject matter experts. So we finished that phase and are working on analyzing all that interview information with coding. We'll begin the second phase of interviews with participants that are currently working in the field of forest carbon monitoring in selected countries. And this is more about the personal narrative. So those are kind of that right column, the case study interviews, and you can see some of the information that we'll be asking them about. Next slide. So after data collection, coding, and analysis is complete, we've blocked off time at the end of the project to synthesize the information. And this will hopefully inform possible strategies and programs for silver carbon to consider. We really are focused on actionable steps to increase women's participation based on the results of the project. So this is just a logic model that provides a visual for the project. I just briefly, very briefly introduced the first 3 purple columns. That last purple column is related to what we hope to provide from the interviews. So this includes country-specific interventions, possible broad sort of information and interventions. And again, with that main goal of informed, actionable choices for capacity builders, such as silver carbon. For example, a website with a page of findings for each country might be easily accessible and informative for program managers. In addition to kind of your standard, maybe peer-reviewed journal article, recommendations for actionable interventions will be based on the subject matter experts and the participant interviews when we get those done. But they may include things such as partnering with schools and other programs, making trainings more accessible, helping women network. So these are just some initial ideas that have been found in previous studies. So, you know, we're still using the information from this study, but just some guiding ideas that are out there. And we expect to be finalizing everything in this project in June of 2022. And next slide. And that's all of the sort of project details. Happy to talk about it more. And at some point, if anyone's interested in more details on some of the other parts of it, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Krista. This was really fascinating to hear about all of this framework. I think it'll be really useful for others. So next up, we have Mary Mitkish from GeoGlam and NASA Harvest. So Mary, please take it away.
Thanks, Emily, and thanks for having me today. My name is Mary. I am the Assistant Program Manager for the NASA Harvest Consortium, which is very closely related to the GeoGlam initiative. Just a brief background on both programs. Emily, if you could move to the next slide, please. GeoGlam is GEO's global agricultural monitoring initiative. It was mandated by the G20 in 2011. And the purpose was to increase market transparency and improve food security by producing kind of this relevant, timely, and actionable information on agricultural conditions and outlook productions. And then related to GeoGlam is the NASA Harvest Consortium, which is NASA's contribution to GeoGlam. NASA Harvest is NASA's food security and agriculture program. We have a broad array of partnerships across the globe. We have over 50 members of the consortium, which in and of itself is very much a diverse group of people. We are also a women-led organization. Our program director is Dr. Inbal Becker-Rushev, and we're very lucky to have a great group of people working with us across the world. Next slide, please, Emily. So I've got kind of 3 categories here listed that we focus on within GeoGlam and NASA Harvest as far as promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion. While the first 2 bullet points, I think there are a lot to be said here about reaching diverse applicants through the hiring process, including kind of thinking really hard about how you're writing your job descriptions to be more inclusive, advertising through a wide range of outlets, and making sure everyone's kind of clear on your hiring process. There's a lot to be said for this, and we try to do those things within both of our organizations. The second bullet here, for your current employees, providing opportunities for career advancement, making sure that you have mentors available for maybe your younger or less representative employees, and kind of encouraging funding support and supporting people who might not normally have the opportunity to take advantage of all that kind of academia and research has to offer. But the one I really want to focus on today is kind of our programmatic activities and how this stakeholder first approach has worked really, really well to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, both for GeoGlam and NASA Harvest. all of our projects, before we take on anything, we make sure that we're engaged with our end users, right? We want to be talking to the people who actually live in the areas that they care the most about. We want to be talking to as many people as possible and make sure that we're actually meeting needs that need to be met across the range of agricultural activities and food security applications that we have going on. So next slide, please, Emily. Really quickly, I just wanted to go into 2 examples that kind of demonstrate how both NASA Harvest and GeoGlam are taking action through our activities to support kind of more inclusion in the agricultural sector. So this first one here is a NASA Harvest project. And again, I'll highlight how lucky we are to have partners across the world. We're working with the Buenos Aires Grain Exchange in Argentina. We just kicked off a pilot program, an educational program in rural regions throughout Buenos Aires. And it's kind of targeted at high school students in rural areas who may not have otherwise had an opportunity to learn about remote sensing and how Earth observations can assist with agricultural monitoring and then food security. And we've seen a lot of interest in the program, and something like this, we really heavily support because diversity, equity, and inclusion, they have mutual benefits across the board. Besides, getting more people involved and caring about their region and their food production, and that's kind of our focus. But on the other hand, the more diversity you have and the more people that you're reaching, by you I mean us, we learn a lot about things we may not otherwise have known about in our limited perspective. For example, me in the United States, I'm ill prepared to judge on what might be needed in other regions of the world. So this is just to say that diversity is not only something we should be caring about, but it's something really, really core to a lot of activities, especially when we're working on a global scale. Next slide, please, Emily. The second one that I want to point out is the GeoGlam Crop Monitor Initiative. Started way back at the initiation of the GeoGlam program, but this has kind of highlighted the need for more equity and diversity and inclusion in our activities. Initially, we had started with the GeoGlam crop monitors for AMIS, which was very successful. The purpose is to provide kind of information on crop conditions in support of market stability for the major agricultural producing countries across the world. And these are places where we have kind of a lot of data already, a lot of resources. And so we're able to build that out. And through this process, there emerged kind of the need to have better agricultural monitoring in less food secure regions of the world, places where there's a lot of vulnerability to food insecurity. So born from the crop monitor from AMIS, we have the crop monitor for early warning now, which has really kind of just grown the amount of participation that we have across the world in agricultural monitoring, and has enabled us to cover a lot more regions that may not have the necessarily the resources or the ability to monitor agriculture as closely as they would need to for the food security of their region. So it's been a really collaborative process, which I think has been a great support of furthering equity and inclusion in the agricultural monitoring. So for the sake of time, I'll go ahead and end there. I'm happy to answer any questions and share more information. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. That was an excellent presentation and showing some really great examples of diversity and inclusion work. Moving on now to Chinapur Michaya with GeoGlows and Severe Mekong perspective. So thank you, Pin, so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you to have me today. So I'm the Chinapur Michaya. I'm working as the Water and Disaster Team Lead and the Severe Mekong Asian Disaster Preparedness Center. Today, I'm going to speak on behalf of the user also to see that how GeoGlows is going to benefit and enhance the service that we have been working under the Severe Mekong. Next slide, please. So we see the benefit of the using from the GEO goals that provide the daily 15 forecast stream flows all over the world, every rivers. So with that, we try to think that, okay, how these products gonna really support our service, and that could link to enhance further on improving the gender equality and social inclusive. But before we go to that, I would like to also introduce our work under the Severe Mekong and how we also work, link and integrate with the gender equality and social inclusive. Next slide, please. So here under the water service, you can see that we work in different areas, try to use the technology and science from the Earth observations in many areas. As you can see here, I would like to focus on the couple of the tools that integrate into the social and economic component as well to enhance the disaster risk reduction in the lower Mekong regions, that are the reservoir assessment tools, the surface water mapping, hydro flood, and the potentials of the other also linked with the drought. With that, I would like to move to elaborate further on the tools under the flood component. Next slide, please. So from here is a tool called historical flood analysis tool. We use the Earth observations to detect the surface water mappings and also try to understand, analyze the hazard and the risk at the township level. This is an example that we did in Myanmar as well. And with that, we also overlay with the population information to see that how many people will potentially have the effect from the flood that's going to happen. Next slide, please. Move to that is a historical flood mapping. Aside from that, we also develop the hydro flood tools. This one is going to be near real-time surface water mapping that we try to fill the gap of the different of the sensors, to fill the gap of the spatial and the temporal resolutions to have the high accuracy of the surface water mapping. So this is the idea to cope with the lacking of the flood map in the regions. With that, we also gonna overlay this surface water mapping with the exposure, buildings, population, information, critical infrastructure to really understand what are the impact, who are the vulnerable group that gonna have the potential of the impact from the flood event. Next slide, please. Aside from that, I would like to highlight of the success story under the hydro flood tools. These also collaborate, work together to support World Food Program in Cambodia. They already integrate our hydro flood results to their platform called Prisms, and these help them to work on provide a bulletin to support the humanitarian response in Cambodia. Aside from that, we also provide capacity building to the officers, both try to make a gender equality as well for both female and male. Please, next slide, please. Aside from the flood mapping service, we also utilize the Earth observation on the climate perspective as well. Those precipitations, GPM, IMERGE, we did bias correction. We also utilize the SHERP-JEF, the medium-term precipitation forecast of the 15 days to use the object-based approach to classify the storm event. With that, Emily, if you click one more time, you can see that after we classify the storm event, we also overlay with the population information, building, and the other critical infrastructure to really give the information to the stakeholders and the user that what are the most likely of the exposure and vulnerability gonna impact, and we provide also the warning guidelines for them to have a better prepare and respond, as you can see from here as an example of our tools. Next slide, please. aside from that, rainstorm trackers linked with the flood risk management, from the reservoir water resources, we also working with the AST Hong Gili and also Professor Faisal also to use the remote sensing, also including altimetry to detect and work further to provide the information on the reservoir. Because if you are aware also that in the lower Mekong regions, the number of the reservoir has been increasing significantly. So these two also will support for flood and drought risk management in the region as well. Next slide, please. So aside from the water, we also see the potential of the use of the GEO growth, which I will elaborate further on the drought service tool, as well as within our drought tool, Mekong drought and cloud watch, that provide a difference of the drought indicator, both the met drought indicator, hydro drought indicator, until the agric drought indicator. But then we still did not have a chance to provide the drought indicator regard with the streamfalls. With that, we see the potential to integrate the GEO growth into this drought management as well. Next slide, please. And aside from that, the last one that ABPC and Survey Mekong has been working also, we also provide the information of the gender inequality index that we work together with the ACI, our consortium as well, to provide how the situation of the genders has been going within the regions for the better plan and improve in the gender equality and social inclusivity. Next slide, please. From there, then we pick up the highlight three of the service that we see that the GEO growth gonna enhance. This is under development that three of the AST Franz Mayer, AST Jim Nelson, and also AST Hong Gili work together with the NASA SCO, together with the KEL. So this one gonna enhance further because we have a near real-time surface water mapping. This one, GeoGrow, will enhance the forecast in undead surface water mapping. Further, this is gonna be great benefit to the region as well for the flood risk management. Next slide, please. Aside from there, for the reservoir assessment tool, you can see that now we run the hydrological models, but then from the GEO growth, we can also use as an input to the hydrological model in the transboundary area and where that watershed lack of the instill data. Next slide, please. Last but not least, for the drought, as I mentioned that the GEO streamfall forecast, this one gonna help us to develop a new streamfall drought index. That's gonna be really enhance the drought risk monitor and forecasting in the region as well. However, next slide, please. How is linked to improve the gender inclusive and social inclusive, sorry. So you can see here that our work framework under the Survey Mekong, we try to translate that big earth data to the risk assessment and then to the action, disaster risk management. Underneath, we see that GEO growth, one click, please, can enhance these three main components of the forecast in undead extension, Mekong reservoir assessment, and also the drought aspect. One click, please, because under our Survey Mekong, we try to utilize not just Earth observation, but also social network and the other census informations to capture the vulnerability of the economic and social, such as the percentage of the elderly over 60 years old or the disabilities, and that overlay to enhance the risk assessment. And then one click, please, to integrate with the gender inequality and social inclusion to leave no one behind within Lower Mekong. Thank you. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me here.
That was a really great presentation, Pen. Thank you so much for joining us at a really late hour for you over in the Mekong. So thank you so much. And last, we have Thomas Moore, who's going to speak to us about Indigenous peoples, particularly in the Amazon basin. So please, Thomas, go ahead.
Thank you, Emily. My name is Thomas Moore. I'm an anthropologist, and I have been hired part-time as an advisor to Severe Amazonia on indigenous peoples. The program also has a gender advisor, but I'm not going to move into her space. So I'll be talking principally about indigenous peoples' inclusion in the services provided. Next slide, please. Severe Amazonia is the latest of the severe programs to be approved by USAID and NASA, of course, supported. Its purpose is to bring geospatial technology from space to village, and in the case of Severe Amazonia, in the initial proposal was included inclusion of both gender equity and social inclusion advisors to work on ensuring that those approaches are incorporated into the services provided in each of 6 Amazon basin countries where the program is working. Severe Amazonia is a demand-driven program. We don't design anything ourselves. We respond to requests from government, university, NGO, and any other appropriate institutional partners, and co-develop the programs with them, providing the necessary training, technical assistance, and so forth. And we don't give grants, so that is a limitation that I'll get to a little later. Next slide, please. The methodology is twofold, basically, for indigenous peoples. In each of the 6 Amazon countries where we're working, we have a national partner affiliate who seeks the inclusion of indigenous peoples in the service design of the services and the implementation of those services by government agencies, universities, NGOs, and so forth, originally planned to be coordinated on the national level with the national level indigenous organizations and COICA, which is the coordinating body for indigenous organizations of the Amazon basin. So that program, that component of the program works with the insurance that where the programs or services are developed in these countries at the request of other agencies or institutions and their indigenous people's presence in the area affected, that those people be engaged and brought into the planning process. So far that's worked reasonably well, at least initially, in 5 of the 6 countries, and we're still planning to do something in Suriname. On the other hand, the Severe Amazonia Indigenous Peoples Advisor seeks to engage locally based IPOs, Indigenous Peoples Organization, to help them co-design their own services. And we're working right now with the Madre Dios Native Federation, FENAMAD, in Peru, in southeastern Peru, which has a serious need for territorial monitoring services because their territories of these indigenous peoples are being invaded by gold miners, all illegal, of course, gold miners, timber extractors, drug traffickers, and various other elements of organized crime, principally. And that's a serious threat to their territories, brings about deforestation, degradation of the environment, and threatens their personal safety. So that's their primary consideration, but there are also some other areas where we can engage them. And next slide, please. The priorities defined already by the indigenous peoples organizations are territorial defense against these gold miners, loggers, poachers, land grabbers, and drug traffickers, documentation of the deforestation and ecosystem threats, and along with that, the possibility of presenting demands on the on the prosecutors and police against the proponents of these illegal activities. In the case of FNMI, they already can detect the UTM coordinates and submit them, and the geospatial images will help them document the threats and the problems that are going on in those areas. In other areas of interest to the organizations themselves are planning for community governance and development. And in fact, the subnational government agencies have participatory budget initiatives which require planes de vida, life plans designed by the communities themselves, but they have to meet all the requirements that the government imposes on them. So the life plans become more another bureaucratic instance of government, which is a requirement for funding, rather than a definition of where the people themselves want to go. But we're working on that to try to make it fit better. The other area is potential disaster warnings, floods, serious fire seasons in the Amazon basin, beginning this time of year or a little later. And indigenous peoples are also affected by these problems and need information to do their own planning. And I didn't mention here, but during the COVID-19 pandemic, there have been levels of coordination to try to address those problems and facilitate access to the medical services, health services provided by government entities. Next slide, please. The principal challenges are that the indigenous organizations are not prepared like governments and NGOs and universities to provide staff with salaries and basic infrastructure, particularly computers and any kind of IT infrastructure. And so in many cases, we have to try to help them develop proposals for funding for those activities, because Severe Amazonia is a network which only provides training and technical assistance and cannot provide grants for these purposes. Among the other challenges, most of the indigenous organizations have very limited IT skills and mapping. Most have some sense of mapping because of their needs for land titles and other documentation that the governments require, but they're mostly operating on limited capacity of computer capacity and limited skills of ArcGIS or similar pirated ArcGIS programs and so forth. There's a need for improving their infrastructure capability, which they'll have to obtain from other sources, and for extensive basic and progressive training and technical assistance so that they'll know how to manage these programs and access the information that's available to them for free in most cases. There is also a challenge from the program itself, of skills for non-technical communication with the indigenous peoples and their leaders, most of whom whose original language is not the colonial language, Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, and so forth. But most of them know enough English to be able to communicate but the problem is that they're not familiar with highly technical terms. So we have to program the training sessions and so forth in a manner that they can understand more effectively and promote more dialogue. The other thing is that the IPOs themselves have at least incipient gender perspectives that they're working on, which is pretty much a requirement for any international cooperation support that they get for their programs. And we're working with them through the gender advisor and the plans for gender inclusion directly with the indigenous organizations themselves and the different services that are being provided. And as I mentioned, we're working with FENAMAD in southeastern Madre Dios for territorial monitoring services, which would include probably, almost certainly will include radar services, because there's a lot of cloud cover in that area of the foothills of the Andes in the Amazon basin. So avoiding the cloud cover with radar services is critical to the providing good services and to their effective responses to the threats to their territories and other crises that arise, such as climate change situations of drought, fires, and so forth. Next slide, please. Yeah, that is basically what I want to present. I'll be happy to entertain questions or develop any of these thoughts further in response to anything you want to hear. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you all so much for some really, really excellent presentations. I've already started to see some chatter in the chat box. Technically speaking, I think we have reached the end of our session. We had some just really great context from the presentations themselves, and I didn't want to interrupt anybody. I've put on the screen here Catherine and my contact information. And we also have the contact information for all of our speakers. So if there's anyone in particular you want to get in touch with and you missed their contact information from the previous slides, please do feel free to reach out to us.